Dave, my wife just sent me a video, and some of our listeners know this, most don't. I've been a lifelong Pink Floyd fan. I still am. And the one of Pink Floyd's best-selling albums is titled Animals. And the tracks on that album, there's one track called Sheep, one called Pigs, and there's one called Dogs. And my wife sent me a video of it's a dog listening to the song Dogs and howling. And I'm still laughing about it.
You've been showing that to everybody.
It's good stuff. What's going on in the world?
You know, it's funny. You and I, that's the one place you and I are just slightly age-wise different. Like, you've got the Pink Floyd and that stuff. And my childhood was 80s music. Somebody just sent me a trailer for a movie coming out.
Yeah.
They're doing the backstory of Tony Soprano as a movie.
Okay.
And the soundtrack looks phenomenal because it's all 80s music in New York. Or in New Jersey. Right? And so I'm listening to this and I'm like, I just want the soundtrack. I'm excited about that. There was a story. Well, actually, speaking of music, I took a long motorcycle ride over the weekend. And I always like to keep an earbud in one ear and listen to some music while I'm riding. And I got to go.
Is that right? Is that possible? Doesn't the wind, isn't that hard to listen to something with all the wind blowing through?
All the new Bluetooth earbuds are like the most, I mean, it's amazing.
It works, okay.
You talk about free market economies and what markets can actually do.
Well, there's an old line that we love, right? Capitalism hates a void, hates a vacuum. So there were some people out there who wanted earbuds that would stay in and you could be able to hear them clearly while driving motorcycles. And here we are. You're telling me it exists.
Going back to this month's case study, when you don't have people regulating things like, I mean, who's regulating earbuds?
Right.
All of a sudden, you can get some pretty cool technology for fairly inexpensively. I remember growing up with bikes, and my dad, I remember the day my dad was wiring his helmet with a speaker and a microphone that came down that he could talk to his friends on the other bikes and everything else. And now I've got this little tiny bud that just goes in one ear. I mean, you could do both, but I need to hear what's going on around me, so I put one in. Anyway, I took a ride down to Lockheed Martin over the weekend. For those who don't know, Lockheed is generally a government contractor for the space program.
Right.
And I got to see a project that one of our guardians is working on or was working on. It's now finished, called the Lucy Project.
He's an engineer, right?
He's an engineer.
So it's just a little, for our digital subscribers who aren't part of chapters, we tend to attract all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds into our Vino Veritas Society chapters, including rocket engineers who go do that during the day. They figure out how to make spaceships fly, and then they come hang out with us in the evening.
We actually have multiple aerospace rocket engineers in our chapters. Some who are now retired and have decided to go move into other careers. And we have everything from that all the way to Fortune 500 CEOs. So it's pretty cool. So I got to see this Lucy project. And the Lucy project, it's something about taking pictures of the asteroids that have gotten caught in Jupiter's orbit, and they want to better understand those asteroids that are circling Jupiter.
Okay.
However, it was just kind of cool to see, like all of the technology and all the things that Lockheed has come up with to be able to do this. And I thought it was kind of interesting timing that I got to see this right around the same time that we are all hearing about the billionaire space race. Right. We have Richard Branson, who last week went up 50-something miles above the Earth's surface to space in what looked like an airplane. I mean, it was really amazing.
Yeah, I saw images of it, video of it.
This wasn't like the typical rocket that we see.
Right.
It looks like
an airplane built around a rocket engine. Is what it looks like.
Well, it looked almost like 3 airplanes.
Yeah.
And then the middle one
detaches
and has a rocket engine on the back, and it took off. But he actually went to space by taking off on a runway, which that's a pretty amazing,
pretty cool
feat of technology when you think about where we're coming from. And now Jeff Bezos is going to do it in the next week. And they're fighting over who actually went to space. And he's
where
saying,
does space begin?
Right, where does space begin? And Bezos is claiming you've got to be 62 miles above the Earth.
He went a mere 54 miles. I'm going up to 62 miles.
Right. And then there's this third company, which I think this would be the one I would do if I was given the option of any of them. And I could never afford any of them. But that's beside the point. The third one is a balloon. And you rise at 12 miles per hour. And you go about 35 to 36 miles above the Earth's surface in essentially what's a hot air balloon in an enclosed capsule.
What if that balloon just keeps going up and up and you can't get it to go back down?
That's what they said about hot air balloons for a long time. They've obviously figured that out. But that one has a full restaurant and a bar in there. There's 8 people who go up together.
Hey now.
And you're actually having dinner overlooking space, which to me, a whole lot cooler. Branson was up there for 90 minutes total.
Right.
Like his entire round trip was 90 minutes. This is a 6-hour trip up before you even start going back down. Right. So you're actually getting to experience this whole thing. And there's no G-forces and you're just kind of floating up and all of a sudden
you have a cocktail while you're looking at space.
Future Vino Veritas Society event.
That's right. Some Vino, some Veritas up in space. Wouldn't that be a great chapter? The space chapter of Vino Veritas Society.
They can go once a month up to 35 miles above the Earth's surface. I'm officially joining that chapter. So anyway.
Well, that's what free people do, right? They work, they create capital by producing value for other people, and then they can spend that capital. They can invest it on all kinds of projects like this sort of thing if they want to. And along the way, think of as these guys are building these. I mean, they're huge operations to build these rockets and all kinds of systems and staff and technology, which means they are buying all kinds of material and services and technologies from other companies. They're keeping a lot of busy people productive.
Right. So I'm wondering who's going to inform Brian Stelter of that from CNN, if for those who don't know. And
I don't know. Who is he?
He's just one of the main primetime kind of editorialist news guys on CNN.
Okay.
And yesterday, or a few days ago, I don't remember the exact day it happened, he gets on TV and he goes on a rant about how dare these billionaires spend their money going into space and using rocket fuel. They're using rocket fuel at the same time that we have a climate crisis in the world.
Yeah.
And it just shows this fundamental lack of understanding of economics, what you just talked about, right? These billionaires, they could be putting their money in mutual funds. They could be putting their money under their mattress. If they didn't trust the U.S. economy, if they hide their money under their mattress, and then what would it do for anybody else? But instead, they're buying things. They're paying really highly trained professional individuals who have developed a great skill set that can provide value to them to go and do that. And then those people go buy things, and then those people go buy things.
It trickles on. It's not just the highly trained people.
Right.
There was a great little essay that our members probably know, and if they're not familiar with it, they should be. And that's Leonard Reed's essay, I Pencil, which is very short, available online. And it just tells the story of something simple like a pencil, a regular number 2 yellow pencil. And he starts showing when you start breaking apart all the paint that covers the pencil, the graphite inside, all the little metal band that holds the eraser on, all those things. They all involve, first of all, they involve labor. People had to make them, and when they were making them, they required elements and different things that are found around the world. And all those elements to get the graphite out, you have to have certain machinery. Those machines are built with, and it goes on. And all of a sudden, from that one little pencil, you get this network of millions of people around the world doing different things. And it all comes together to make one pencil for, I don't know how much a pencil is, 5 cents, 10 cents, something like that.
And then for all those people who have made, money on the creation of pencils, they go buy other things that they need.
That's right.
For their own life, all have that same same story to it, and that helps all of those people who are involved, and it, so on and so on and so forth.
And that all springs from something as simple as a pencil. So imagine something as complex as a rocket ship that's going to go into space and come back safely.
It's a reminder that I think we need to remind people often. There's a lot of people on the socialism side of this world who think trickle-down economics is fake. And they point to statistics about, well, look at the pay scale difference between a CEO and his employees. There's no trickle-down economics. That's not what trickle-down economics is. Trickle-down economics is when somebody builds something and is productive and they buy all the materials that go into it, or they provide a service that requires them to use other materials, all of those things, they trickle down to other people who were involved in the creation of it. And it's really the only way that wealth can grow.
Well, so the talking heads at CNN might not understand or appreciate freedom, but there are growing numbers of people around the world who do understand and appreciate freedom. We're seeing some of them taking to the streets right now in Cuba, of all places, a place that hasn't known or experienced freedom for more than half a century, going all the way back to the Cuban Revolution in the middle part of the 1950s.
It's really an interesting point. I mean, if somebody were to watch CNN and watch Brian Stelter try to explain what's happening in Cuba, how could he? How could he really explain it if he doesn't understand how that foundation of economics works, how people providing products and services to other people helps people on a large scale? It's an ever expanding net and helped all these people. How could he possibly understand why people are asking and chanting and protesting for liberty in Cuba?
I would think a number of progressives, including the journalists at CNN and others, probably can't really get their minds around something like the unrest we're seeing in Cuba. I mean, they on the very surface level, they understand there are people who are hungry who don't have food and they're sick and they don't have medicine and basic things like that they want. But as they drill into it a little bit, the American observers and critics and journalists and those types, the chattering political class, they're progressives. And so what are they going to recommend? We know what they're going to recommend: more progressivism, more central planning. And yet when you look down at, think of all the sort of the uprisings, the protests that we've seen in recent decades. I mean, they span around the globe and really different kinds of places and very different kinds of people. Hong Kong, Venezuela, places like Iran in the Middle East, now in Cuba. I mean, these are very different ways of life that you find in those places and different kinds of people. And yet there is this one common thread that connects them. They're all forms of central planning, all of them. Whether it's communist central planning, which justifies itself by the claim of science. That's what the communists say. Well, communism is science, and we're using scientific expertise to control people's lives. Or someplace in Iran, which is a kind of theocratic religious central planning. But it's still a form of central planning, right? Where the Islamic clerics or imams have received word from God about how everyone should be living their life, and therefore we're going to impose it on them whether they want to or not.
Which is really no different from the monarchical, the monarchies of the past, right? The monarchies that we had for centuries were the king would say, this is how you're going to live. Why? Because I was chosen by God to tell you how to live, and you're going to live the way I tell you, and I'm going to provide you as much as I think you need, and I'm going to give you the resources that I think you need, and you don't need or shouldn't want anything more than that.
And here's the thing, on this theme here of progressive central planning, this fascination with central planning that progressives have had for many decades. When you look at Cuba, it really is a model of progressive central planning. You and I have talked about this before, and it's good to remind our listeners that progressivism often gets labeled different things. Progressivism sometimes comes in the form of communism, sometimes in the form of socialism, sometimes in the form of fascism. But these are all just slightly different variations of the same central phenomenon.
Right.
You know, I want our listeners just to imagine a hypothetical. Imagine you get attacked violently, personally, and somebody kidnaps you, assaults you, beats you up, steals your money, and you're like, man, who are you? And he says, I'm a communist. And then 6 months later, something similar happens. You get kidnapped, you get beaten up, your money's stolen. You say, well, who the hell are you? And he says, I'm a fascist. And later you're telling the story. Man, I got attacked, I got kidnapped. This guy was controlling me. He took all my money. And he said he was a communist. And then the same thing happened 6 months later. And imagine someone listening to you said, no, Dave. Those two incidents had no similarities at all. One was a communist and the other said he was a fascist. So there's no right. From the point of view of the victim, it doesn't really matter much if it comes with the label communism or socialism or fascism. It is all a form of some assume that they have the rightful authority to command others, to control others, to take from others. I mean, I almost find this amusing when I see academics and social scientists and the literary types trying to make these supposedly important distinctions between socialism on the one hand. Socialism is good,
right?
But fascism is bad. You know what it really boils down to? It boils down to this. In the case of socialism, the government says, we are taking the means of production. We're taking your factory. We, the government, own it. In the case of fascism, the government says, you can keep the title, the deed to your factory, but you're going to run it the way we tell you to run it, or we'll take it from you. Well, what's the difference in these two situations?
What's the perfect example of that? China, right? In China, the government owns significant portions, if not all of most of the factories, most of the the companies. You can't be an American company operating in China unless a Chinese-owned company owns 51% of your business. And it's interesting to bring up China because you talked about sort of a lot of these Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Hong Kong, all of these places waving American flags and chanting for liberty. What's the most famous one? Tiananmen Square. Yeah. Where they were reading the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, they were.
Right? You talk about people who wanted to understand the foundations of this country, of what made American freedom right and good and what made it work. Yeah. They were studying it. These were college students in communist China trying to study it. And that terrified the Chinese.
Absolutely. In fact, for those who don't remember, in Tiananmen Square, I mean, it was a terrible moment in human history. And I mean, you're right. You had these students out there, they're reading the Declaration of Independence, talking about these ideas like government by consent of the governed, or, you know, the idea that the purpose of government is to protect the rights of the governed. And the communist regime there responded with tanks. I mean, not just a show of force, tanks. These were unarmed 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. These are kids. And a column of tanks rolled in. There's some famous video about, I don't even know if we know the guy's name. I only have heard him referred to as Tank Man. He's the guy who had walked over to the store and gotten some groceries. And he has a couple bags of groceries in his hands. He's just had enough. And here are this line of Chinese tanks coming at these students, and he goes and stands right in front of them. Just this dude with grocery bags in his hands, and he stands right in front of him. We don't know the fate. I don't think anyone knows the fate of that man. I'm sure it wasn't a good thing. But that's the power of those core ideas. Like, all men are created equal, that every human being has these unalienable natural rights to life, liberty, their own private property, their free pursuit of happiness. And government has one simple job, and that is to protect those rights, protect the private property, protect the individual liberty, and it should do that with the consent of the governed. That's a pretty small, list of basic ideas, and those ideas shake tyrants to their core.
The one thing you didn't say there, and correctly didn't say, and I think it's important that everybody realizes, is you didn't say provide for the people.
Yeah.
You didn't say one of government's proper purposes is to give the people what they need.
Now, I want to contrast. You're absolutely right. Shift over to Cuba, where large numbers of people are right now. They're in the streets. They're angry, and they are shouting freedom. They want liberty. They're waving. Many of them are waving American flags because I think in their mind they equate the United States with some semblance of individual liberty.
Right.
They don't know. I don't know if the people in Cuba know that there's an entire class of progressive citizens here in the United States who want to become more like Cuba. They're advocating for these things.
Who walk around wearing Che Guevara T-shirts.
Yes.
Who elect people like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Who says that Fidel Castro wasn't a bad guy.
And here's the thing, when you look at the Cuban Revolution, it took place in the mid-1950s, and Fidel Castro and his brother, what was the brother's name? He's still alive. Raul. Fidel and Raul Castro really spearheaded this effort to topple the Cuban government and put in place a socialist communist regime, which they did. And Fidel Castro was at the head of that thing for decades, as typically is the case with these things, right? And
I think Vladimir Putin just made himself president for life.
For life, of course. Of course he did.
Right.
And early on, they had attempted a kind of coup in Cuba, and it had failed. If I remember right, I think Castro spent a little bit of time in jail, 6 months, a year, something like that. Got out. He and his brother went to meet up with a bunch of other international communists who were gathering in Mexico City, and this is where they meet Che. I always bumba his last name, Guevara, and they head back to Cuba together. So Che is a central role in not just in the Cuban Revolution, but in the atrocities that follow. I mean, Che in particular becomes in charge of things like the firing squads and determining whose crimes against communism warranted execution and who would be granted reprieves and things like that. And when you look at their personal backgrounds, every one of them came from wealthy families, capitalist business families, which provided high-level education. They went to the best schools. They went off to university. Fidel Castro went to law school. Che Guevara went to medical school. And it's at the universities where they're surrounded by progressive academics preaching Marxism and socialism and fascism and all of these kinds of central planning themes. In that sense, they are models. They are success stories of what American universities have become, of what American universities aim to do. Because, I mean, look at how they're designed. The universities are staffed top to bottom with devotees and apostles and disciples of Karl Marx and Woodrow Wilson and all the German progressive social scientists who literally invented fascism.
Right.
That's what's being taught. It's as if our universities here in the United States want to produce more Castros and more Ches. In fact, I mean, where you find the most Che? His image is on a lot of T-shirts.
Right.
Go to a typical university. Go to a typical public university campus. You'll see more Che T-shirts there than anywhere else.
They're wearing T-shirts of a known murderer.
Yeah.
Of somebody who had no respect for the equal individual and natural rights of his fellow citizens.
I saw a young man recently. I was eating at one of my favorite places, Pete's Kitchen, right on Colfax. I'll put out a good word for Pete's Kitchen. I love Pete's Kitchen. And guy walked by on the sidewalk, had a Che t-shirt, and he had his rainbow, and he was carrying a rainbow flag, the rainbow, the gay pride flag. And the guy was too far away for me to talk to him, but I wanted to point out to him, Che Guevara, who's on your t-shirt, used to line up homosexuals
right.
and have them shot. And you're celebrating him as you carry your rainbow flag. It just shows the utter confusion.
It's the same thing as people who like the group LGBTQ for Palestine, right?
Right.
It's the same thing.
Yes.
You want to go wave that flag in the Gaza Strip and
Right.
see what those Arabs do to you? Good luck with that.
Yeah.
So there's two angles I think that we could take from this, and I think we should go down both of them. One is sort of the American United States response to what's happening in Cuba, and how our government and how the progressive wing of the United States is looking at what's happening in Cuba, and then I think we also should look at sort of all of these movements in general, whether it's Cuba, whether it was Hong Kong, last year, a year and a half ago, the yellow vests in Iran a few years before that, go all the way back to Tiananmen Square. Talk about a little bit about what happened there. But I pulled up and I saved, and I think it's worth going over. I want to just read President Biden's remarks.
Sure.
He put out a very short little press statement
Right.
on what's happening in Cuba.
Okay.
And I found it really interesting because there are so many moments in Joe Biden's speaking. And I know a lot of us we love to look at the videos of him bumbling around and not
Right.
sure what he's saying.
Right.
But when he actually does read the teleprompter or he prepares a statement or has somebody prepare a statement for him, he says a lot of things that a constitutionalist should love and would love. And I sit there and I say, you're right. So why are you taking your thought process is right.
Yep.
And then your action is the complete opposite. And where is that disconnect happening? Are you just telling people what they want to hear? What's the source? And this is it. So I'm going to go through it.
These are remarks delivered by Joe Biden.
This is just a written press statement.
A press statement.
A written
okay.
press statement that was put out on behalf of the White House regarding what happened. And I'm going to stop in between. It's like 3 or 4 sentences long.
Okay.
We stand with the Cuban people in their clarion call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from decades of repression and economic suffering to which they have been subjected by Cuba's authoritarian regime.
So he combines two things there. There's the pandemic, which most of the world has dealt with.
Right.
And that's a very new thing. But the much bigger, much older thing are decades of, what do you call it, repression?
Yeah. Repression and economic suffering, which they have been subjected by Cuba's authoritarian regime.
So he is denouncing
Right.
authoritarian government.
Now,
Good for Joe.
let's be clear. This is a guy who has simultaneously called Trump authoritarian.
Right.
And he represents a large part of the population that has called Trump authoritarian.
Right.
Bernie Sanders, we just said it, has recognized or has commended Cuba's efforts repeededly. And when asked just this week, do you still stand by those statements? He said yes. He said, he didn't disagree with it. So it is hard to argue based on that first sentence that authoritarianism and progressivism lie in the same category. They are the same thing.
Right.
Next sentence. The Cuban people are bravely asserting fundamental and universal rights. Those rights, including the right of peaceful protest and the right to freely determine their own future, must be respected.
Wow. That sounds to me a lot like individual liberty.
Right. Sounds like something that
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right?
Sounds like something that came right out of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm thinking, okay,
Yeah.
this
Sounds pretty good.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm on board, Joe.
Yeah.
You want to be that president?
Yeah.
I would even vote for you.
Yeah, that's right.
If you're going to be that president, I'm
right.
in. And then he says this: the United States calls on the Cuban regime to hear their people. Good. Hear
Yep.
their people.
Yep. As a reminder, the people are saying liberty.
Right.
We want freedom.
We want freedom.
Yeah. Okay.
The United States calls on the Cuban regime to hear their people and serve their needs at this vital moment rather than enriching themselves.
Serve their needs.
Okay. So there's two key things that come out of that very end. One, you just said it, serve their needs, right? So all of a sudden, he's saying, hear their people. They're asking for freedom.
Freedom.
They're asking for the right to go be free and make decisions for themselves and go
create wealth.
Go create
Be
wealth.
productive.
And he takes that as government needs to serve them.
Yeah.
Government needs to, and back to what we talked about towards the beginning of this conversation was part of the reason that the people of Cuba are protesting is because the government has been unable to provide them their COVID vaccinations.
Well, and many other things. Food. I mean, Cuba's famous for, in fact, anybody can go on the internet, just do a quick Google search of grocery stores in Cuba, and what you find are images of stores where the shelves are almost all empty. Right. There's a few little items scattered, but they're empty. And the point is, Cuba, the Cuban government has been failing to provide for the needs and wants of the people while promising they were going to. We're going to just be a little more patient. We're working on it.
Right.
We know you're hungry, and we know you need houses, and we know you need education, and you need health care, and you need all these things. Just give us one more month, one more year, one more decade. We're going to get this right.
Right. So they're saying serve them, give them. Yeah. While the people are saying just give us the freedom to go take care of this. Respect our freedom.
Yeah.
Or acknowledge our freedom.
Stop stealing our freedom. Stop stealing our liberty.
To be able to go and make some of these, take care of ourselves and be productive and develop the wealth we need to be able to go. If we want COVID vaccines, go buy them.
Well, and what you did, you just put your finger on, in a way, the most basic alternative, the two alternative ways of looking at government that there might be. One alternative is to look at government as providers, some form of Santa Claus. Mm-hmm. That government exists to give us stuff. And then people can debate whether it's things we need, things we want, some combination. How does one define a need? The point is it's going to give us stuff. The other way to look at government is government's going to make sure you are secure in what you already have, your freedom, your private property, so that you're free to make of your life what you want to make of it. And the challenge there is when government protects freedom and that's it.
Right.
There are people who don't do much with their freedom. There are. They're called lazy. And it's an old phenomenon, and there are people who just don't do that much, and they're not very productive, and they don't create much wealth, and they tend not to have, a lot of options in their life. But there are many other people who do. When they are free, they are very productive, creative, entrepreneurial, and they teach their children to be the same. Those really are the basic ways that we could look at government. Give us stuff or protect our liberty and stop. Because once you cross that line and say we want government to give us stuff, the only kind of government that can be a provider government is a controlling government. Right. If a government's going to give stuff, because all governments produce, they produce zero wealth. Look at what a government does. Governments pass laws, they enforce laws, they judge whether or not people have broken the government's laws. I mean, that's the nature of legislative, executive, and judicial power. And in that whole process, creating laws, enforcing them, judging if people broke them, no wealth is created.
Right.
Nothing of value, right? Mm-hmm. No computer is designed. Correct. No food is grown. No house is built. None of those things that people value. And so if government is to give something of value to some, it has to take from somebody. And if it doesn't have enough people to take, then it has to start commanding. You, Dave, you have to go plant crops in the field because I'm the government and I promised these people over here free food and I don't have any food to give them. So you, right? And then I send an army to point guns at you and say, you're going to go plant food in the crops in the field.
And there's two, I keep saying there's two ways to go about this. And there's another aspect of that we're seeing directly from Cuba right now. Cuba doesn't have the finances, even at the highest levels. There's not enough money in the economy right now in Cuba for even the government to take all of the money from Cubans to go purchase vaccines. So what did they do? They came and begged the United States. They came and begged us for those vaccines. And what does the United States do? Well, we need to help the people of Cuba, so we're going to take from our citizens. So now, in order to help the Cuban government, they had to take from American citizens to fund the passing of vaccines to Cuba or other countries, which we're now seeing all over the place.
Here's another piece of how all this works. When a central planning tyranny ratchets up its control, because these things always go down. They always spiral down as people get hungrier and sicker, and the schools become worse, and their kids aren't learning anything. Those in power, they want to maintain their power. That is their number one goal. And so they think what they need is more central planning. And so we're going to command everyone. And when they're trying to do that, when you're trying to command an entire national population, the last thing you want are some critics out there pointing out what you're doing wrong and how government programs are failing and not producing the results and all the people who are suffering. And so these things almost always end up restricting freedom of speech, restricting the press, right? Censoring, controlling. We got to control how people talk so that the regime doesn't look so bad, the government doesn't look so bad.
Right.
And that's the case of Cuba.
Which is why China has outlawed all social media.
That's right.
Because it's not just America where they're trying to control one small group of people or one vocal group. They're trying to control all people. The last three words of Biden's remarks, of the White House statement. I feel like sometimes I can't even call them Biden's remarks. It's the White House statement. Whoever
someone
made it.
wrote him and somebody released him to the press.
He didn't even have his name on it. So it is the statement from the White House. And we have been told at press conferences that Joe Biden doesn't always speak for the White House.
Right. That's right. You're right.
We had that. We talked about that in a previous podcast. So his last three words, stop enriching themselves. He's talking about the Cuban regime needs to start serving the people and stop enriching themselves. And it's like this progressive administration that we have in America today just put its finger on the very problem of progressivism and of central planning. And that is human nature doesn't change, and inevitably those in power always end up enriching themselves before taking care of anybody else. Before trying to take care of anybody else.
Right. You mean like a vice president in government might direct taxpayer-funded grants to other nations, which end up going to nationally controlled oil companies where the vice president's son sits on the board and gets paid tens of thousands of dollars a month?
Well, yeah, just to ensure that vice president eventually becomes president.
That's right. Yeah.
So yes.
For those who don't know, we're talking about Hunter Biden.
Right.
This is what Joe Biden did when he was vice president under Obama, directed all this foreign aid to the Ukrainian government. And it's an oligarchy there. The government there controls everything. So there's a national oil company in Burisma in Ukraine. That money goes from the United States to the Ukrainian government, to Burisma.
Right.
Burisma has a board of directors. Hunter Biden, who has nothing to do with the world of oil and gas, is sitting on there, and they're paying. They're paying the vice president's son something like $50,000, $100,000 a month.
Right.
And he's saying, don't use government to enrich yourself.
To enrich yourself.
Yeah.
And I want to address that to all the people out there who say, well, socialism just hasn't been done right. Communism just hasn't been done right. Progressivism, Marxism hasn't been done right. And we just need to do it right here in the United States. And we can and we will, because those in government in the United States, those are good people. Really? You just gave the story about Joe and Hunter Biden. Maxine Waters represents a group of a constituency in South Central Los Angeles. You live not far from there.
I used to deliver bingo supplies in that neighborhood that she represents. Yeah, when I was in graduate school, that was my part-time job. I worked for a company that, if you ever been into a place where they play bingo, you got the papers And then you have the ink daubers where you mark, right? And we even sold the big machines where you turn the crank and all the bingo balls, right? The big electric signs that show which number, all that. And what I quickly learned, I went from small town Kansas to Southern California and started working this job delivering bingo supplies. And what I learned quickly is people in the wealthy areas like Beverly Hills, they don't play bingo.
No.
Where you find lots of bingo halls, and they tend to be in like VFWs. A bunch of Catholic churches had their weekly bingo meetings and bars and things like this. They tended to be in the poor, rundown areas. And South Central LA, I was down there all the time delivering bingo supplies.
It also happens to be a fairly lucrative business. I know a few people in that world that do very, very well for themselves. Another conversation for another time. But Maxine Waters represents these people. Mm-hmm. She lives in a $6 million mansion.
Yep.
Nowhere near her constituents. She doesn't live their life. She has profited. Nancy Pelosi, how many times has she profited? We just heard in the last week or two that Paul Pelosi, her husband, just sold off.
That's right.
Or bought and sold a whole bunch of stock in different tech companies. He was trading stock
after a discussion with Joe Biden.
Okay, I missed that part. I thought it was just a conversation with his wife. But,
well, the point is Joe Biden decided he was going to shift the whole federal fleet of vehicles, which is millions of cars. Okay. Every car. You know, the Department of Agriculture has cars. The IRS has cars.
Right.
They're going to switch it all over to electric cars. I think Tesla.
Right.
And so mysteriously, Nancy Pelosi's husband buys something like $500,000 in shares.
Yeah.
Days before the president announced the federal government is going to sign this contract with Tesla.
You and I are actually talking about two separate occurrences.
Oh, okay.
Which just shows how often this happens.
Yeah.
He was just trading a lot of Facebook and Twitter and Google and things like that.
Yeah.
Because he knows what Congress is planning on attempting to do in terms of breaking up or preserving the big tech companies. Yeah. He could tell where Nancy was able to tell him where things were going and he was able to do that. And we've seen this over and over and over again. Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. Bernie Sanders owns 3 homes, multiple cars, boat, you name it.
I guarantee if AOC, who by all appearances does not come from a lot of money in her background.
She does.
Does she? Well, if she stays in Congress for a few decades, which she might, she's kind of popular among us, certain constituency, I guarantee she will emerge. She'll leave, if she ever leaves, later in her life, much wealthier than she was when she started. And here's the thing: this is true not just in the United States, but everywhere around the world, where you find governments that control people's lives to a large extent, confiscate other people's property to a large extent, redistribute it. We could even come up with a category. We could call them redistributive regimes that focus on taking from some to give to others. You find the political class in charge of that. They're the ones living in the palaces, lined with gold, right, and eating the best food. Because what they always do in all that confiscating from some to give to, they always first put it in their own pocket.
They put some off the top.
Absolutely, yes.
We've said this a million times. They are a mafia.
Yes.
It is a legal. You say legalized use of force.
Yeah.
I say it's a legalized mafia. They are skimming right off the top. Mm-hmm. It is. They are running money laundering schemes through public employee unions. They are skimming off the top of every tax bill, of every other thing. They are trading on insider tips. They are doing everything that we say that is against the free market system, and they are enriching themselves. And Joe Biden just called out.
And if you object to it, Dave, if you ask a question about, they'll say, you must be a racist, or you must hate children, or you don't care about the earth. You're bad because they put these labels, these brands on all their programs and their efforts, and they stick to the brand. They don't want to talk about what's going on behind the scenes. And I think the bigger point here is this is because they're human beings. And human beings anywhere, in any situation, no matter what language they speak or what skin color they have or what kind of sexual preferences they have, it doesn't matter. If they're human beings, they are going to serve their self-interest first. That's what human beings do.
So they enrich themselves.
That's right.
It just seems amazing to me that Joe Biden can make or that the White House can make this whole statement about individual rights and freedoms and all of these things. And he can say to Cuba, stop enriching yourselves, and not turn around and look at what's already happening in this country and still somehow believe that we could do, as they like to say, well, we could do progressivism right.
Now, here's the key to all this. Human beings pursue their self-interest. That's universal. That is unchanging. That was true of human beings 5,000 years ago. It will be true 5,000 years from now. What does change are the institutional arrangements, the incentives people find surrounding them.
Sure.
So in the case of a business, it's good to enrich yourself. The question is, how do you enrich yourself? In the case of a business, every business owner wants to enrich himself and his family. How can a business owner best enrich himself? By creating lots of value for other people. That is his path to getting to enriching him. We're trying to enrich ourselves at the Vino Veritas Society by providing value for our members.
Right.
And if we're not doing a good job of that, right, we have a problem on our hands. We're going to shift gears in large part out of our own self-interest. Yeah. It's in our interest to make other people happy, to supply happiness. I like to tell people when they say, what is the Vino Veritas Society? Sometimes my shorthand answer is, we're in the happiness business. We want to provide happiness. We want to provide value to other people. But if you're in government, it's a very different set of circumstances. So you take these same beings, human beings, who want to enrich themselves,
right,
pull them out of a business environment and stick them into a government environment. Now the incentive, the ability that they have right in front of us, hey, we don't have to produce value for others. We can just go take it. We have that power of taxation. We can just take from them what we want to take.
So then there's the other path. I said earlier, two ways to look at this.
Yeah.
And that other path is, we're seeing this in Cuba right now. We saw it in Hong Kong. We saw it in Iran. We saw it in Tiananmen Square. We saw it in Venezuela. You might be able to correct me on this, but I can't think of many situations since the American Revolution where something actually changed from these protests. I mean, it's upsetting to me.
Yeah.
Like, truly upsetting to me when you think about what was happening in Hong Kong a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
It was a center point of international news.
Yep.
And nobody talks about it anymore. It's gone. The Yellow Vest movement in Iran, it just disappeared.
Yep.
People stopped going out in yellow vests and protesting. In Venezuela, they protested until they had so little nourishment that there was nothing left to protest. They didn't even have the energy to go out and do it anymore.
Right.
And it's important for us to explore. All of these countries have said they show out, these protesters show out, they wave their American flags.
Yep.
They might even read the Declaration of Independence. They might have some fights. You had the guy, I think about, and this isn't really the exact same thing, but the Killdozer scenario in Granby and Grand Lake, Colorado.
Right. Yeah.
The guy who just said, government is violating all of my rights and nobody's listening to me and I'm going to go out and I'm going to do something about it. And then you have all the way up to this last election. There was this viral Twitter thread that got read on Tucker Carlson's show. It's become this big thing explaining all of these people who don't feel like they have a voice.
Right.
And why they were so angry on January 6th. And they all disappear and they all stop. None of them are ever successful in creating change.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you look historically, there have been moments where people have come out and protested and they get change. And very often it's for the worse. And these are older examples. I'm thinking of something like the French Revolution.
That's the first thing that came to my mind too.
Big change did happen. It was worse after the revolution than before, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But in more modern times, in more recent decades, I think what you're describing is largely the norm. You see these ripples of protest and nothing really comes of them. And very often the protests are to some degree in support of freedom, but very often there's confusion even among the protesters. Right. There's not a uniform set of ideas or principles or some, you might have one person waving the American flag and demanding freedom, and you might have someone right next to him demanding free food and free medicine. Yeah. It means they're not all on the same page.
Where's my vaccine?
Where's my vaccine? Something like that. And I think a big part of that is in these tyrannical regimes, first of all, it's dangerous to actually go talk to people about ideas like freedom. In many cases, it's genuinely prohibited by law. Like you are taking your life, and you might be thrown in a dungeon if you're caught meeting with other people and actually talking about freedom. It is one of the beautiful things here in the United States. We have many problems. The beautiful thing is we are still free. We have the freedom. We can meet and have a glass of wine and talk about the ideas of freedom. We do that at the Vino Veritas Society. What you find in Hong Kong and Venezuela and Iran and Cuba, there is no Vino Veritas Society, and there's nothing like it.
Right.
They're not meeting in people's homes and in restaurants and in bars and getting to know each other and socializing and discussing these core ideas and practicing. How do we communicate this to the political class, to the media class, to our fellow citizens? None of that's happening. And so when their anger tips over into rage and they can't control themselves and they run out into the street, they don't have any kind of uniform, clear, coherent message. And that's one of the reasons those protests tend to fizzle out. They're not focused on one thing. It also fuels American progressive observers, media and political pundits here in the United States. They can see in those protests signs of what they want to see. They can find someone in there demanding free stuff. And they say, see, these are a bunch of progressives in Cuba demanding free stuff, because there's not a coherent set of ideas or message there.
Well, I think the point is, it's not the type of thing that you can just get fed up with one day and go change overnight, right? You're not going to just say, we're not getting our vaccine, so it's time to go do something about it. We're going to go take to the streets and demand our vaccines and demand our freedom. It doesn't work that way.
Yep.
It takes years. I mean, we talk about the start of the sort of development of the United States of America. It didn't start with Thomas Jefferson. It didn't start with George Washington. In fact, they probably weren't even alive yet when it started. It really goes back to Ben Franklin as a young man with his junto, the leather apron.
He called it the Leather Apron Club.
Right, which was him and a few friends getting together and writing out ideas of what rights are and what and how to think and how to analyze.
How the purpose of government is, how individuals can prosper and improve their lives within a framework of freedom.
As well as studying the classics and essentially doing what we today in school would call a book report, right? Yeah. What was Aristotle talking about in the Ethics? Yep. Or what did Shakespeare mean in this passage? And analyzing those things to an extent where you could start having conversations. And then what happens, it just goes step by step by step. You first start finding that core group that understands it. You take that next step of starting to build a culture of people who understand it. That group, that smaller group, goes and spreads it throughout the wider culture. And then you start to have a situation where people will say, hey, you know what? We're going to stand up and we're going to try to do something about it, even though we might not be perfect at it yet ourselves.
Right.
But we're going to start the movement. And you've said this time and time again, the American Revolutionary period really didn't end until the end of the Civil War.
Yeah, I would make the argument that when I think of the American Revolution, I mean, we can look at specific dates. You know, the actual shooting begins in 1775, Lexington, Concord, those early battles. The Declaration of Independence comes the next summer in July of 1776. But really, as a broad political phenomenon, The American Revolution begins all the way back in the 1720s with things like Ben Franklin forming his Leather Apron Club, and it stretches all the way through the Civil War, because the American Revolution is fought on behalf of this idea of human equality, equal protection of the laws for the equal individual rights of everyone who lives under the laws. And the revolution isn't completed in the founding period. It's the Constitution is incomplete because we still have this problem of slavery among us. And so it takes 2 more generations. It takes a Civil War. It takes the 13th Amendment to really bring the regime, bring the fundamental law in alignment with those core ideas. That's a long period of time. That encompasses a lot of people. A lot of people are born and die in that long stretch of time. And that means there's a lot of work to be done to teach and spread and inspire others with those ideas of liberty.
And to find people who you're willing to gift your trust to.
That's right.
Right? And that's another big thing, that if you're running out into the streets chanting liberty in Cuba right now, do you trust that the person next to you is looking for the same thing? Have you studied together? Have you gotten to know each other? Have you broken bread together?
Or is the person next to you
trust?
A spy for the government?
Right.
Could be.
And
in a tyrannical regime. Could be.
They have already come out admitting. The Cuban government has said police are out in civilian clothing, grabbing people.
Yep, absolutely.
They are kidnapping people.
Yeah.
And you could go all the way. You know, we did a little bit on January 6th, but it's sort of similar here.
Yeah.
Right. It's a bunch of people who were upset and I understand why, but they didn't know each other.
They were strangers,
and they didn't trust each other.
Yep.
And they didn't know, what do you want versus what am I looking for, and are we both respecting each other's rights, and do we understand what's virtuous and what's not? I mean, there's so much to this.
The point you're making reminds me of that famous conclusion of the Declaration of Independence, where the signers pledged to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor.
Right.
And what's interesting about that pledge, they did not make that pledge to God. They didn't even make the pledge to all their fellow countrymen or fellow revolutionaries. They made it literally to each other.
Yep.
There were 39 guys in a room together, standing around a table, and they know if I put my name on this document and I get caught, I'm going to be hanged. I'm going to be executed. This is treason. And so they're looking at each other. This is a scary thing, right? Each one's thinking, I think I'm willing to put my name on this, right? I will. Dave, if you will, are you in? Right, I'm in if you're in. It's one of those they all want to make sure that they're in this together.
Right.
And that's the beauty of the American Revolution. Sometimes I describe the revolution as a freedom trust, because there was that bond, there was that trust, there were those relationships. And in a way that is at the core of what we're doing through the Vino Veritas Society, especially the chapter side of the organization that actually meet. And I don't know how to do that work right now. I don't know how to spread the Vino Veritas Society in the short term to places like Cuba and Hong Kong and Iran. But that is the thing that they are really in need of. That they are sorely missing that, to build those relationships, build those trusts, build that common understanding of the important principles, practice some common messaging, how to talk about these things. They're in desperate need of that, and it makes me appreciate what we're doing here at the Vino Veritas Society even more.
Right, and I just wanted to bring that up at the end, because we hear from our members all the time. We've got to do something today. We've got to do something right away about fixing this country. Mm-hmm. It's lost. We're in trouble. It's not going to happen overnight.
Nope.
It can't happen overnight. Every single attempt, no matter how good that attempt was, every single attempt of the last 20, 30, 40 years in all parts of the world that have tried to overcome the progressive root, the central planned root cause of the problems in that country have failed because people didn't have a common understanding and didn't trust each other.
For our members who don't know this about us, we should be clear. We have we've taken a very long-term view, a long-term strategy behind the Vino Veritas Society. We've never said to anybody we're going to fix this country or save freedom tomorrow. What we have said is over decades, over generations, we are going to have Vino and Veritas Society chapters, groups, friends in neighborhoods and towns across the country, thousands of them, so that 100 years from now, 200, when we're long gone, the Vino and Veritas Society it's going to be around,
right.
And that's going to be the place where freedom-loving citizens talk, meet, socialize, have a good time, have some fun, break some bread, drink a little wine together, and deepen their understanding of the core principles.
Have some backyard concerts.
That's right. That's right. All that good stuff.
We just got to sit in with a chapter who did that. This can be fun, but you've got to build those two things.
Yep.
You've got to build that common understanding and agreement, and you've got to build trust.
You're right.
And that's what makes us the guardians.
That's right. Till next time, no sumos custodes.